Band of Brothers was never meant to be a documentary. Even so, if you listen to interviews with Tom Hanks, he often emphasized that while the series would dramatize real events, it would avoid unnecessary embellishment. The goal, he said, was to tell the veterans' stories as faithfully to history as possible. One difficulty with that promise, however, lies in the source material. The series leaned heavily on the book Band of Brothers, written by Stephen Ambrose, which the production team treated almost like a guidebook throughout development. Over time, critics and historians have pointed out that the book itself contains a number of inaccuracies, something many believe resulted from insufficient fact-checking and cross-referencing during the research process. Ambrose's son, Hugh Ambrose, who sadly passed away in 2015, once mentioned that he and his siblings helped conduct much of the research for their father's books, including Band of Brothers. Hearing that has led some observers to wonder whether the research process may not have been as rigorous as readers expected for such an influential historical work. Years later, John Orloff, one of the writers of the television series, acknowledged in an interview that parts of Ambrose's book were indeed incorrect. He suggested that some of those mistakes might have come from the veterans themselves misremembering details during their early interviews with Ambrose. After all, many of those conversations took place decades after the war, and memory can sometimes blur the edges of events over time. Still, critics argue that the responsibility for verifying those details ultimately rests with the writers and producers who adapt such material for television. Orloff himself later became the main writer for the series Masters of the Air, another World War II drama connected to the same creative team, and that production has also sparked debates among viewers about historical accuracy. Before the television series was ever filmed, Stephen Ambrose had already sold the screen rights to his book to Tom Hanks. Because of that, many people feel that the final responsibility for any questionable portrayals in the show falls largely on Hanks and his production company. Hanks has often described himself as deeply passionate about history, particularly the history of the Second World War. Yet despite ongoing discussions about various inaccuracies in the series, he has rarely publicly addressed those criticisms or offered corrections regarding how some veterans were depicted. Some criticism has also been directed toward Richard Winters himself. While he wasn't responsible for the final edit of the book or the television series, he was closely involved with the project and was said to have approved what was written. Because of that role, some observers have wondered why he didn't challenge more of the errors that later appeared in the work. A large portion of the material used in the book Band of Brothers came directly from Winters' own recollections. Much of his memory of the war had been preserved in letters he wrote during the conflict, along with notes and personal records he kept afterward. Those documents were later provided to Stephen Ambrose, who used them as one of the primary foundations for writing the book. Another major source for Ambrose's account came from the writings of David Webster. Webster had served in Easy Company and had kept detailed notes about his experiences during the war. Although he died in 1961, 3 decades before Ambrose's book was published, his work eventually reached a wider audience when it appeared in the 1994 book Parachute Infantry. Together, the letters and recollections of Winters and the writings left behind by Webster formed a large part of the narrative that shaped Band of Brothers. They offered a deeply personal window into the experiences of the men of Easy Company, though, like many first-hand accounts written years after the events themselves, they also left room for interpretation and debate among historians and readers alike. Most people who watched the series would probably agree that Buck Compton quickly became a favorite. Among the men who had actually served with him, like Don Malarkey and Bill Garnier, he was remembered as one of the most well-liked officers in the regiment. Still, several scenes involving him in Band of Brothers were shown without much context, or portrayed him in ways he later felt didn't quite reflect how things really happened. When Buck first arrived at Old Bourne, the series shows him appearing at a pottery airfield. In reality, arriving as a brand new second lieutenant in Easy Company made him feel very much like an outsider. The men he was about to lead already had a reputation for being elite. They had trained together for nearly 2 years under some of the harshest conditions, much of that time under the demanding leadership of Herbert Sobel. The first officer Buck really got to know was Harry Welsh, who served as assistant in 1st Platoon under Richard Winters. Welsh made an immediate impression, Buck later remembered him as the kind of person you liked right away. Since Compton was assigned as assistant to 2nd Platoon, which was led by Pat Sweeney, he didn't get to spend as much time with Welsh as he would have liked. Not long after Buck arrived at Oldbourne, Sweeney was transferred to battalion staff, leaving Compton in charge of 2nd Platoon with Ray Schmitz as his assistant. Around this time, Buck received a letter from his high school sweetheart, Jerry. In it, she explained that she would not be waiting for him to return home after the war. It was likely the same girl he later mentioned during the events at Bastogne. One afternoon he walked out of the mess hall holding the letter, shaking his head. Don Malarkey, who served in Compton's platoon, noticed something was wrong and came over to ask what had happened. Malarkey understood the situation all too well. He was dealing with his own complicated relationship back home, something he later wrote about in his memoirs and nearly turned into marriage after the war. The two men began spending time together talking about their lives before the army. Before long, Malarkey, Bill Garnier, and Buck had formed a close friendship. Although Buck tried to look after his men as best he could, he depended heavily on his non-commissioned officers to handle the everyday running of the platoon. Outside of Easy Company, he had little contact with anyone else, aside from a few officers from Dog and Fox companies who happened to be billeted in the same house. Buck later admitted that in those early days he did very little direct leading. Malarkey, Garnier, and Joe Toy had things running smoothly, and they helped make him feel welcome from the start. Unlike some platoon leaders, Buck rarely found a reason to discipline anyone, which helped him earn the respect and popularity of the enlisted men. That popularity, however, carried a risk. Military doctrine frowned upon officers becoming too friendly with the men they commanded. Buck understood the reasoning behind the rule, but the distance never felt natural to him. Most of the men were about the same age, many of them with college behind them, and the officers' usual pastimes, drinking heavily or playing poker, never really appealed to him. One evening after dinner, he left the officers' mess and noticed a group of Easy Company soldiers gathered around a game of craps. Curious, he wandered over to watch. Staff Sergeant Johnny Martin looked up and asked if he wanted to join. Buck shrugged, said why not, and tossed a few English pound notes onto the table. Within minutes, the money was gone. Not long afterward, Richard Winters saw what had happened and confronted him. In the series, the moment is shown with the two men arguing while riding in a jeep. In reality, Buck remembered it very differently. Winters' criticism was sharp and one-sided, delivered loudly enough for anyone nearby to hear. Winters told him the problem wasn't the gambling itself, it was the relationship he was forming with the enlisted men. Buck tried to brush it off, saying he had simply been enjoying some time with the guys. Winters responded with a remark that struck him as odd coming from another officer. If he liked the men so much, Winters said, maybe he should move out of the officers' quarters and bunk with them. By then, Buck was getting irritated. Winters wasn't his direct superior, and the public scolding had begun to wear thin. Maybe I will, he shot back. I've got more in common with them than I do with you. After that, the conversation ended and the two men went their separate ways. Looking back years later, Buck admitted Winters had been right. If he had the chance to do it over again, he said, he would probably have handled things differently. For many officers, forming friendships with the men they commanded could make the realities of combat even harder. Ordering someone you knew personally into a situation that might lead to his death was something not everyone could bear. For Buck, though, that thought rarely crossed his mind. As a former college football and baseball star, he had always seen himself as part of a team. He expected his men to do what he would do himself, and he held himself to the same standard. If anything, he was often harder on himself when one of his soldiers was lost. That became painfully clear during the fighting at Bastogne, when the casualties among his platoon, especially close friends like Bill Garnier and Joe Toy, hit him deeply. Other officers, including Ronald Spears or even Winters himself, seemed more able to accept losses as part of the job. Viewers saw moments in the series where leaders such as Robert Strayer ordered men forward despite obvious danger, sometimes even straight into German machine gun fire. For some officers, the objective came first. The individual soldier was secondary. Buck sometimes wondered whether he could have been a better leader in certain ways, but he never believed his approach had harmed discipline or caused anyone to be wounded or killed. He was proud to consider men like Don Malarkey not just soldiers under his command, but friends and equals. His relationship with Richard Winters remained more distant. During the war, they were never especially close. There were moments when Buck felt Winters supported him, such as recommending him for the Silver Star after the action at Brecourt Manor on D-Day, but other moments left him less certain. Years later, when watching Band of Brothers, Buck sometimes felt that the writers, and perhaps even Winters, who had served as a chief consultant for Tom Hanks and Steven Spielberg, had portrayed him in ways that suggested cracks in his mental state. One example came just before Easy Company was shipped to Bastogne. In the scene, the men sit watching a John Wayne movie while Winters quietly questions Buck, who stares off into space. To Buck, the scene implied that his wound in Holland had begun to break him mentally. He didn't remember it that way at all. The series even suggested that at one point he told the others to leave him behind for the Germans, something he insisted never happened. That would have meant giving up, and quitting simply wasn't in his nature. After Eugene Rowe treated his wound, a jeep quickly arrived and drove him away from the line. As Buck later described it, the injury itself had been relatively painless and far from life-threatening. While recovering in Reims, he felt perfectly fine and didn't recall attending any movie screenings on base at all. Soon after, Easy Company and the rest of the 101st Airborne Division were rushed toward Bastogne. What followed would take Buck's war in an entirely different direction, and that chapter would become a story all its own.